April 3, 1917. Finland Station, Petrograd. A sealed train pulled in from Germany carrying 32 Russian exiles who had spent the previous decade in exile, writing pamphlets, arguing endlessly about revolutionary theory, and waiting for a moment they were not sure would ever arrive. The man who stepped off the train onto the platform was short, balding, and completely unknown to most of the world. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. History knew him as Lenin. The crowd that met him at Finland Station was enormous. Sailors from the Kronstadt naval base, workers, Red Guards, a band playing the Marseillaise. Lenin was lifted onto an armored car and delivered a speech to the crowd while searchlights swept the night sky. A woman in the crowd later said she felt that Russia had made the transition from the most brutal, arbitrary rule to the freest country in the world in a matter of days. Within 6 months, Lenin and his Bolshevik party would overthrow Russia's provisional government, seize power in a coup, and set in motion the chain of events that produced the Soviet Union. The Cold War, Mao's China, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the nuclear standoff that defined the second half of the 20th century. But the train that brought Lenin to Finland Station did not materialize by chance. It was deliberately arranged by the German government. Germany was at war with Russia. German military planners calculated that Lenin, a committed revolutionary, who had spent years arguing that the war was a capitalist enterprise that should be ended immediately at any cost, would destabilize Russia and help knock it out of the war. They were right. The arrangement was explicit state policy. Germany put Lenin on a sealed carriage, escorted him through German-held territory, and sent him into Russia like a biological weapon aimed at the heart of the Russian state. What if Germany had made a different calculation? What if a single German official had looked at the situation and decided the risk was too high, that unleashing a committed revolutionary might produce consequences nobody could control? To understand what that world looks like, you have to understand what Russia looked like in April 1917 without Lenin. The Tsar had already abdicated in March. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of autocratic rule, was already over before Lenin arrived. In its place stood the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, a socialist revolutionary lawyer who had been one of the most prominent figures in the Duma. The provisional government had immediately implemented sweeping liberal reforms: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to form political parties, the abolition of the secret police. It had released all political prisoners. It was preparing elections for a constituent assembly that would write Russia's first democratic constitution. From the outside, in those first weeks of March and April 1917, Russia looked like a country on the verge of becoming a democracy. The problem, the fatal, irreversible problem, was the war. The provisional government decided to keep fighting. This was not entirely irrational. Russia had treaty obligations to Britain and France, and leaving the war unilaterally would mean surrendering vast territories to Germany, potentially including Ukraine and the Baltic states. Kerensky believed, or convinced himself he believed, that a renewed Russian offensive could change the military situation and give Russia leverage in peace negotiations. He was catastrophically wrong. The June 1917 offensive was a disaster. The Russian army, already exhausted, mutinous, and politically radicalized after years of staggering casualties, collapsed in many sectors. Soldiers deserted by the hundreds of thousands. In the countryside, peasants who had been waiting for land reform began seizing the estates of nobles without waiting for permission. The economy, already strained by 3 years of war, was producing shortages of food and fuel in the cities. Workers in Petrograd were going hungry. It was into this situation that Lenin arrived, with 3 words that cut through every complicated argument about treaty obligations and democratic procedure and the proper pace of reform. Peace, bread, land. Not eventually, now. The Bolsheviks were the only significant political force that offered people what they actually wanted in April 1917, stated plainly and without qualification. In a world without Lenin, the Bolsheviks still exist. But they are a different party without him, smaller, more hesitant, lacking the iron organizational discipline and the absolute tactical ruthlessness that Lenin embodied. The Essex Student Journal, drawing on historian Sean McMeekin's research, argued directly that without Lenin and Trotsky, who converted to Lenin's cause after reading his April Theses, the success of a Bolshevik dictatorship seems highly improbable. The February Revolution still happens. The Tsar still abdicates. The provisional government still takes power. But the coup of October 1917, which required Lenin's specific combination of timing, ideology, and willingness to seize the moment regardless of democratic legitimacy, very likely does not happen in the same form. Kerensky himself, who spent the rest of his long life in exile arguing that Russia had been ready for democracy, was half right. Stanford University magazine, examining his legacy, concluded that it would have taken a miracle for Russia to have gone from near absolute monarchy to a functioning democracy given the circumstances, but noted that the door was not entirely closed. The Kerensky government's fatal weakness was the war. Without the war destroying the economic and social fabric, without the June offensive being the catastrophic failure it was, the provisional government might have held together long enough to convene the Constituent Assembly and establish a constitutional framework. And here is the Constituent Assembly detail that history almost never discusses. In November 1917, after the Bolsheviks had already seized power, elections for the Constituent Assembly were held anyway. The Bolsheviks won 168 seats out of 703. The Socialist Revolutionaries won the most seats. The Russian people, given a free vote, chose moderate socialists over Bolshevik radicals by a wide margin. Lenin dissolved the assembly after 24 hours, declaring it counter-revolutionary, because it did not give his party the majority it needed. That was the last free election Russia would hold for over 70 years. In a world where Lenin never returns, the Constituent Assembly is not dissolved after one day. The election results stand. Russia's new government is a coalition of moderate socialist and liberal parties, led by people committed to land reform, social welfare, and ending the war through negotiation, rather than through one-party seizure of state power. Whether that government survives is genuinely uncertain. The pressures on it are enormous. The civil conflict in the countryside is real, and the German military threat does not disappear. But it does not face a Bolshevik coup in October. The consequences of this single counterfactual cascade across the entire 20th century. Without the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, there is no Soviet Union. Without the Soviet Union as a model and a patron, Mao Zedong's communist movement in China has no great power sponsor, no theoretical framework explicitly legitimized by a successful revolutionary state. The Chinese Communist Party still exists, but the particular form of Marxist-Leninist organization that enabled it to seize power in 1949 is weakened or absent. China may still have a revolution. The pressures of poverty, inequality, and Japanese invasion are real, regardless of Russia. But it may not produce the specific totalitarian state that killed tens of millions in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Without the Soviet Union, there is no Cold War in the form we know it. The United States does not orient its entire foreign policy around containing communism. The Korean War, which was fought specifically to prevent Soviet and Chinese-aligned communism from dominating the Korean peninsula, may not happen. The Vietnam War, which was American military intervention to prevent the spread of Soviet-aligned communism in Southeast Asia, loses much of its logic. The proxy wars that the US and USSR fought across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, conflicts that killed millions of people who had nothing to do with Marxist theory or American liberalism, do not occur in the same form. And here is the deepest irony of all. The Russian Revolution, which was supposed to liberate the workers of the world from capitalist exploitation, produced in practice one of the most brutal and repressive systems of government in human history, a system that killed millions of its own people, enslaved entire nations in Eastern Europe, and triggered an arms race that almost ended civilization in 1962. The workers it claimed to represent lived in poverty, under surveillance, without free speech, without free movement, without the right to choose their own government for 70 years. Lenin arrived at Finland Station at 11:10 p.m. on April 3, 1917. He was lifted onto an armored car, and the crowd cheered. A few months later, he overthrew the only democratic government Russia had ever had. He dissolved the only free election Russia would have for 3 generations. Germany sent him like a weapon. He worked exactly as intended. If Lenin had never returned to Russia, do you think Russia would have become a democracy? Drop your answer below.